In the dusty Arizona territory of 1890, wealthy cattle baron Silas Maddox placed a simple newspaper ad for a ranch cook. He expected a capable man who could handle the work without complications. Instead, destiny delivered Annie Whitlow, a widowed mother of two, with nothing but determination and a fierce will to survive. What began as a desperate arrangement between a guarded rancher and a woman with nowhere else to turn would challenge everything Silas believed about solitude, safety, and second chances. Annie brought more than cooking skills to his remote ranch. She brought life to rooms that had been silent for years, warmth to a man who had forgotten how to feel, and hope to children who had known only hardship. But when dangerous secrets from Annie's past surface and a rival rancher threatens their fragile peace, will Silas choose the security of his old life or risk everything for love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Broken Arrow Ranch as Silas Maddox stepped onto the weathered porch of his sprawling adobe home. At 43, he possessed the bearing of a man who had built something substantial from nothing broad, shoulders that carried responsibility without complaint, hands that bore the calluses of honest work despite his wealth, and eyes the color of winter sky that had grown accustomed to looking at horizons rather than into other faces. The ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the Arizona territory, a testament to 20 years of careful planning and relentless determination. Silas had arrived here as a young man with little more than ambition and a head for business, purchasing parcels of land when others saw only desert and possibility where they saw hardship. Now, his cattle bore his brand across 3 counties, and his name commanded respect in every bank, from Tucson to Phoenix. Yet for all his success, Silas lived like a man camping in his own home. The rooms remained as they had been furnished years ago, functional, sparse, decorated only by the accumulated dust of solitude. His father's leather journal sat on the mantelpiece, its pages filled with cattle records and occasional personal reflections that revealed a loneliness success could not cure. Silas had read those pages many times, recognizing in his father's careful handwriting the same isolation that had become his own companion. The kitchen, where he now stood nursing his morning coffee, embodied this masculine neglect. Clean but cheerless, it served its purpose without warmth. Meals were eaten quickly, standing at the counter or carried to his office, where ledgers and correspondence awaited his attention. The dining room, with its long oak table capable of seating 12, had not hosted a proper meal in over a decade. This morning, however, change arrived in the form of a letter from town. Silas had placed an advertisement in the Tucson Weekly, Citizen 3 weeks prior. Wanted, cook for working ranch. Room and board provided. Must be able to handle basic meals for ranch hands and owner. References required. Apply at Broken Arrow Ranch, 20 miles north of Catalina. He had expected responses from weathered men who could handle the isolation and demands of ranch life. What he received instead was a single reply, written in careful script on paper. That had seen better days. Dear Mr. Maddox, I am writing in response to your advertisement for a cook. While I may not be what you expected, I assure you I am capable of all kitchen duties and more. I am recently widowed with 2 children, and in desperate need of steady work and a safe place to live. I can cook, clean, keep books, and manage household affairs. I ask only for fair wages and a chance to prove myself. I will arrive Tuesday morning by the 10 o'clock stage. Respectfully, Mrs. Annie Whitlow. Silas had crumpled the letter initially, muttering about complications he did not need. A woman with children on his ranch would disrupt the ordered simplicity he had cultivated. Children meant noise, questions, the messy unpredictability of family life he had deliberately avoided. Yet something in the careful dignity of her words, The quiet desperation beneath her formal language had made him smooth out the paper and read it again. Now, as Tuesday's sun climbed higher, he found himself watching the dusty road that wound through the desert toward his ranch. The stage would arrive soon, and with it, a decision that would test his conviction that solitude was safer than connection. At precisely 10:30, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Silas set down his coffee and walked to the front gate, his expression carefully neutral. The old Concord stage rattled to a stop, its driver spitting tobacco juice before climbing down to retrieve luggage from the boot. "Mrs. Whitlow?" The driver called toward the stage door. The door opened, and Silas felt something shift in his chest. Annie Whitlow emerged like a woman stepping into an uncertain future, but determined to meet it with dignity. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical style beneath a faded blue bonnet. Her dress, while clean and mended, showed the careful attention of someone who made much from little. But it was her eyes that caught him green as spring grass, holding both wariness and hope in equal measure. Two children appeared beside her, a girl of about 8 with her mother's coloring, and a boy perhaps 6, whose dark hair and serious expression suggested he had learned too early that the world required careful watching. They stood close to their mother, small hands gripping worn carpetbags, taking in this new place with a mixture of fear and curiosity that children brought to great changes. "Mr. Maddox?" Annie's voice carried the hint of an accent he could not quite place, cultured enough to suggest education, but tempered by recent hardship. "I am Annie Whitlow. These are my children, Mary and Thomas." Silas removed his hat, an automatic gesture of courtesy his mother had drilled into him decades. "Go, Mrs. Whitlow. I received your letter. I hope you received it favorably." She met his gaze directly, neither bold nor submissive, but somewhere between a woman who had learned to advocate for herself and her children. "I know I am not what you expected, but I can do the work." The stage driver coughed impatiently. "Where do you want these bags, mister?" Silas looked at Annie, at the children who watched him with solemn eyes, at the few possessions that represented everything they owned in the world. The smart thing would be to send them back to town, to stick with his original plan for a male cook, who would require nothing more than wages and a bunk in the quarters behind the kitchen. Instead, he heard himself saying, "Set them on the porch." Relief flickered across Annie's face, quickly controlled. "Thank you, Mr. Maddox. I will not disappoint you." As the stage departed in another cloud of dust, the 3 travelers stood before his gate like pilgrims seeking sanctuary. Silas studied them, these unexpected arrivals who had already disrupted his careful order simply by existing. "The job pays $30 a month, room and board included," he said finally. "You cook 3 meals daily for myself and whoever's working. Breakfast at dawn, lunch at noon, supper at sunset. You keep the kitchen and main house clean. Laundry once a week. Think you can manage that with 2 children underfoot?" "Yes, sir." Annie's chin lifted slightly. "Mary is old enough to help, and Thomas is well behaved. They will not interfere with my duties." Thomas chose that moment to wander toward the corral where Silas's prize stallion, Thunder, stood watching the newcomers with intelligent dark eyes. The boy approached the fence with the fearless curiosity of childhood, reaching through the rails toward the massive animal. "Thomas, no." Annie started forward, but Silas was already moving. "Easy there, son." Silas's voice was gentle as he caught the boy's hand. "Thunder's friendly enough, but he's also big enough to step on you without meaning to. You want to meet him proper?" Thomas nodded solemnly. Silas lifted him up to sit on the top rail of the fence, keeping a steady hand on the boy's back. Thunder approached with the dignity of an elder statesman, allowing Thomas to stroke his velvet nose. "He's soft," Thomas whispered, the first words he had spoken since arriving. "That's how you know a good horse," Silas replied. Soft nose, gentle eyes. Thunder here has been with me for 8 years. Haven't you, old friend? Annie watched this interaction with something approaching wonder. As if she had not expected kindness from this stern-faced rancher, Mary had crept closer too, drawn by her brother's obvious delight. I suppose, Silas said, setting Thomas back on the ground, you should see where you'll be staying. He led them through the main house, conscious of how empty it must seem to people accustomed to making a home rather than simply occupying space. The kitchen was large enough for their needs, with a cast-iron stove that had seen better days but still cooked evenly. A room off the kitchen had been used for storage, but could be cleared for the children. And this, he said, opening the door, to what had been his housekeeper's quarters before old Mrs. Patterson had returned to her sister in California, would be yours. The room was clean but stark, containing only a bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table beneath the window. Annie ran her fingers along the dresser's surface, perhaps imagining how she might arrange her few belongings to make it home. It will do very well, she said simply. When would you like me to begin? No time like the present. The hands will be in for lunch in an hour. Think you can manage something from what's in the pantry? Annie smiled then, the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. Mr. Maddox, managing something from nothing is what I do best. As she moved about the kitchen, taking inventory of supplies and assessing the capabilities of the old stove, Silas found himself watching her with an attention that surprised him. There was efficiency in her movements, but also something more a quality he could only describe as homemaking, the ability to take a mere room and begin the alchemy that transformed it into a place of warmth and sustenance. The children, released from the formality of first impressions, began to explore their new surroundings with growing confidence. Mary discovered a cat sleeping in a patch of sunlight by the back door, and was soon engaged in the serious business of making friends. Thomas returned to the corral, maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly enchanted by the horses. There, good children, Silas observed. They are everything to me, Annie replied, not looking up from the biscuit dough she was kneading. Their father died of fever last winter. After that, she paused, her hand stilling for a moment. After that, there was not much left for us in Kansas. Sometimes a person must be willing to travel toward an uncertain future rather than remain in a certain failure. Her words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, and Silas recognized in them the same philosophy that had brought him to Arizona 20 years ago. Perhaps this unexpected turn would not be the complication he had feared. The sound of approaching horses announced the return of his ranch hands. In a few minutes, these men who had grown accustomed to his plain cooking and silent meals would discover that the Broken Arrow Ranch had acquired not just a cook, but a woman with children, bringing with them all the unpredictable changes that families inevitably carried. As Annie began setting the table with the same careful attention she had given everything else that morning, Silas realized that his ordered, solitary world was about to expand in ways he could not yet imagine. The question was whether he possessed the courage to let it. The first test came sooner than expected. As Annie pulled fresh biscuits from the oven, their golden tops releasing clouds of steam into the kitchen air, the sound of boots on the porch announced the arrival of Silas's crew. She smoothed her apron and checked her reflection in the window glass, straightening a strand of hair that had escaped its pins during her hurried preparations. "Mary, help me carry these plates to the table," she whispered to her daughter, who had been quietly setting out the mismatched china she had found in the cupboard. "Thomas, wash your hands at the pump." The men who entered removed their hats in a gesture of automatic respect, but their faces registered surprise at finding a woman in their familiar domain. Jake Morrison, Silas's foreman for the past decade, recovered first with the easy grace of a man comfortable around all kinds of people. "Well, I'll be," he said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Boss didn't mention we'd be dining with a lady today. Mrs. Whitlow, Silas said, his voice carefully neutral. These are my men. Jake Morrison, my foreman. Pete Hernandez, Carlos Mendoza, and young Billy Walsh. Each man nodded respectfully as his name was spoken. Pete and Carlos, brothers who had worked the ranch for 5 years, offered polite buenos dias, while Billy, barely 20 and still carrying the enthusiasm of someone new to ranch work, grinned openly at the children. "Ma'am," Jake said, settling into his usual chair, "I hope you won't take offense if we say we're mighty pleased to see someone who actually knows their way around a kitchen. The boss here makes coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, but his biscuits could be used for building materials." Annie's tension eased at the gentle teasing, recognizing the affection beneath the words. "I hope you'll find these more suitable for eating than construction." The meal that followed revealed the careful balance Annie would need to maintain. The men, accustomed to grabbing quick, functional meals before returning to work, found themselves slowing down to savor food that had been prepared with actual care. Her biscuits were light and flaky, the beans seasoned with herbs she had found growing wild behind the kitchen, the coffee strong but smooth. More importantly, conversation began to flow around the table in a way that had been absent from Silas's solitary meals. Jake asked Mary about her doll, a worn fabric creation that had clearly traveled many miles. Carlos taught Thomas the Spanish words for horse and cow. Billy, with the awkward gallantry of youth, complimented Annie's cooking with such earnestness that she blushed. Silas watched this transformation of his midday routine with conflicting emotions. The warmth was undeniable, the sense of community around his table, something he had not realized he missed. Yet it also made him acutely aware of how isolated he had become, how deliberately he had constructed walls that were now being gently but persistently challenged. After the men returned to their work, Annie began clearing the table with Mary's help, while Thomas explored the main room under Silas's watchful eye. The house felt different with their presence fuller somehow, as if rooms that had been holding their breath were finally able to exhale. "That was well done," Silas said quietly as Annie carried dishes to the wash basin. The men appreciated the effort. "They seem like good people," she replied, rolling up her sleeves. "A bit lonely, perhaps, but good-hearted." Her observation struck closer to home than she could have known. Ranching can be isolating work. A man gets used to his own company. Annie paused in her washing, studying his profile. "Used to it, perhaps, but that doesn't mean he prefers it." Before he could respond to this gentle challenge, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention to the window. A lone rider was approaching at a leisurely pace that suggested social rather than business purposes. Silas's expression darkened as he recognized the visitor. "Expecting someone?" Annie asked, noting his change in demeanor. "Clayton Morse," Silas said, the name carrying obvious distaste. "Owns the adjacent spread to the south. We don't often see eye to eye on matters of neighborly conduct." The rider who dismounted at the gate was perhaps 50, dressed in clothes that spoke of wealth consciously displayed rather than earned through work. His silver-banded hat and tooled leather chaps were more suited to a parade than practical ranching, and his horse, while beautiful, bore the soft look of an animal that spent more time being admired than working. Clayton Morse entered without invitation, his eyes immediately assessing the changes in the familiar space. When his gaze fell on Annie, his expression shifted to one of speculative interest that made Silas's jaw tighten. "Well, Silas," Clayton said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "you've been keeping secrets from your neighbors. Mrs. Whitlow is my new cook," Silas replied evenly. "Annie, this is Clayton Morse." "Ma'am." Clayton's bow was elaborate, his smile too practiced. "What a delightful addition to our little community. I had no idea Silas had acquired such charming staff." The pause before the word staff was deliberate, and Annie felt the insult beneath the false courtesy. She inclined her head politely, but did not return his smile. "Mr. Morse, I hope you'll excuse me, but I have work to attend to." Of course, of course. The burdens of employment. Clayton's tone suggested that he found her position amusing rather than respectable. "Silas, might we speak privately? I have a proposition that could benefit us both." Silas gestured toward his office, but not before Annie caught the warning. Look he sent her way. She busied herself with her tasks, but could not help overhearing fragments of the conversation that drifted from the adjacent room. "Prime grazing land along Willow Creek. More than willing to make a generous offer, woman. Like that in a place like this. Creates talk, you understand." Silas's responses were too quiet to hear clearly, but his tone carried a coldness that needed no amplification. The meeting concluded abruptly, and Clayton emerged looking less pleased than when he had arrived. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said, pausing near the kitchen door, "I do hope you'll find our territory welcoming. Though I should mention that desert life can be challenging for those unaccustomed to its particular demands. Should you ever find yourself in need of alternative arrangements, I would be happy to discuss opportunities at my ranch." The offer was delivered with the same false courtesy as his earlier words, but Annie recognized the threat beneath the supposed kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Morse, but I am quite content with my current position. For now, perhaps. But circumstances have a way of changing, don't they? Good day." After Clayton's departure, the house felt somehow smaller, as if his presence had brought with it the weight of unspoken complications. Silas stood at the window, watching the distant dust cloud until it disappeared over the ridge. "What did he want?" Annie asked quietly. "He wants to buy the grazing rights to my southern pastures. Claims his cattle need the water access during dry seasons." Silas turned from the window, his expression troubled. "What he really wants is a foothold on my land. Give Clayton Morse an inch, and he'll find a way to take the whole ranch. And my being here complicates that somehow?" Silas hesitated, clearly reluctant to burden her with the full implications. "Clayton has opinions about proper social arrangements. He's also on the territorial council and carries influence in town. A man in his position can make life difficult for those who don't meet his standards of respectability." The word hung between them, loaded with the social judgments that could destroy a woman's reputation and, by extension, her children's future. Annie felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with the recognition of how precarious her position truly was. "Perhaps I should—" "No." Silas's interruption was firm. "Clayton Morse doesn't dictate how I run my ranch or whom I employ. If he has a problem with my decisions, he can keep his opinions to himself." But even as he spoke the words, both of them understood the reality of their situation. Annie's presence on the ranch, however innocent and practical, would be viewed through the lens of scandal by those looking for reasons to criticize. A single woman living in the same house as an unmarried man, caring for his meals and his home, would provide endless fuel for wagging tongues. That evening, as Annie tucked her children into their new beds, she found herself facing the same difficult choice that had brought her to Arizona in the first place. Stay and risk the scandal that could harm not only herself, but Silas and her children, or leave and return to the uncertain mercy of a world that offered few options for women in her circumstances. "Mama," Mary whispered in the darkness, "I like it here. Mr. Silas was kind to Thomas about the horse, and the cat let me pet her. I know, sweetheart. It's a good place. Are we going to stay?" Annie listened to the night sounds of the ranch, the gentle lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the mesquite, the distant call of a coyote. Through the thin walls, she could hear Silas moving about the main house, the creak of floorboards. Under the measured tread of a man wrestling with his own thoughts. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." As sleep finally claimed the house, Annie lay awake, weighing possibilities against consequences, hope against fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, for the first time in months, her children were sleeping safely under a solid roof. Their bellies full and their immediate future secure. It would have to be enough, at least for now. The following days settled into a rhythm that surprised Silas with its naturalness. Annie rose before dawn to start the coffee and begin breakfast preparations, moving through the kitchen with quiet efficiency while her children still slept. By the time Silas emerged from his room, a smell of bacon and fresh bread would fill the house, transforming his sterile morning routine into something approaching warmth. Mary proved to be her mother's capable assistant, setting tables and washing dishes with the serious competence of a child who had learned responsibility early. Thomas, meanwhile, had appointed himself unofficial ranch mascot, trailing after the men when his mother allowed it, and absorbing their patient lessons about horses, cattle, and the endless cycle of work that kept a ranch running. It was Thomas who provided the bridge between Silas's guarded world and the family that had entered it. The boy possessed an insatiable curiosity about everything from the windmill that pumped water to the barn cats that kept the grain stores free of mice. More importantly, he showed no fear of Silas, approaching him with the same straightforward interest he displayed toward everything else in his new environment. "Mr. Silas," Thomas said one morning, appearing at Silas's elbow as he examined a section of fence that needed repair, "why do the cows have numbers painted on them?" "So we know which ones belong to us," Silas explained, setting down his hammer to give the boy his full attention. "See that brand there? That's the broken arrow mark. Means she's mine. Like how Mama writes our names in our clothes. Exactly like that. Smart thinking." Thomas beamed at the praise, then studied the fence rail Silas had been working on. "Can I help?" The request caught Silas off guard. His first instinct was to refuse. Ranch work was dangerous, and a 6-year-old boy had no business around tools and livestock. But something in Thomas's earnest face, the way he had asked permission, rather than simply assuming, made Silas reconsider. "I suppose you could hand me nails when I need them. But you stay right where I can see you. And if I say step back, you step back quick. Understood?" "Yes, sir." For the next hour, Thomas served as Silas's assistant with the gravity of someone entrusted with vital work. He handed over nails with careful precision, asked thoughtful questions about why the fence needed to be exactly so high, and absorbed Silas's explanations about cattle behavior and property boundaries with the focused attention of a dedicated student. Annie watched this developing friendship from the kitchen window as she kneaded bread for the day's meals. The sight of her son working beside the tall rancher, both of them bent over their task with identical concentration, stirred something in her chest that was equal parts gratitude and longing. Thomas had been without a father figure for nearly a year, and she could see how he hungered for the kind of steady male presence that Silas represented. The transformation was not limited to Thomas. Mary, initially shy around the ranch hands, began to emerge from her protective shell as the men proved themselves gentle and patient with children. Pete Hernandez taught her to braid rope, while Carlos showed her how to whistle through her fingers to call the barn cats. Jake Morrison, despite his gruff exterior, proved to have a talent for storytelling that kept both children enthralled during lunch breaks. But it was Annie herself who represented the most profound change to the ranch's daily life. Her influence extended far beyond the kitchen, touching every aspect of the household's operation with an organizational efficiency that Silas had not realized was missing. She mended clothes that had been making do with temporary repairs, organized the pantry with a system that actually made sense, and somehow managed to have hot water ready whenever someone needed to wash up. More than that, she brought a quality to the house that Silas struggled to name. It was not simply cleanliness or order, though both had improved markedly. It was something more fundamental, the difference between a place where someone lived and a place where someone made a home. The evening meals became events in themselves. Where Silas had once eaten quickly and in silence, now the dining room, filled with conversation. The men lingered over their coffee, sharing stories of the day's work, or debating the merits of different approaches to common problems. The children added their own observations, Thomas describing everything he had learned while Mary shyly offered her own questions about ranch life. Annie presided over these gatherings with a grace that seemed effortless, but which Silas suspected required considerable skill. She drew out the quiet men, gently redirected conversations that threatened to become heated, and somehow managed to make everyone feel both welcomed and valued. It was a talent he had not encountered before, this ability to create community around a simple meal. "You're different with them," Annie observed one evening as they worked together to clear the dinner dishes. The men had returned to their quarters, and the children were absorbed in a game of checkers by the fireplace. "Different how?" Silas asked, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "More present, I suppose. As if you've remembered that work is only part of what makes a life worth living." Her words touched something he had been reluctant to examine too closely. The truth was that the rhythms of family life, the necessity of considering others in his daily decisions, had awakened. Aspects of himself that he had deliberately suppressed for years. The careful isolation he had cultivated no longer felt like protection. It felt like deprivation. "Maybe I had forgotten," he admitted, hanging a dish towel on its hook with more attention than the task required. A man gets used to thinking only about the next day's work, the next season's planning. Forgets there might be other things worth considering. And now? He looked at her then, really looked, taking in the way the lamplight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of someone who had found reasons for joy even in difficult circumstances. "Now I'm beginning to remember what I've been missing." The moment stretched between them, filled with the recognition of something growing that neither had quite planned for. It was Annie who broke the spell, turning back to her tasks with a slight flush in her cheeks that suggested she was not entirely unaffected by his words. Outside, a horse nickered softly in the corral, and the sound brought both of them back to the present reality of their situation. Whatever was developing between them would have to navigate the complex social expectations that governed relationships between employers and employees, between single men and widowed women, between those who had much to lose and those who had little left to protect. Later that night, as Silas sat in his office reviewing the day's accounts, he found his attention drifting to the sounds of family life that now filled his house. Annie moving quietly about the kitchen, finishing the last of her tasks. The children's voices from their room, muffled by the wall, but carrying the easy chatter of siblings secure in their surroundings. The gentle domestic sounds that had been absent from his life for so long that he had convinced himself he did not miss them. His father's journal lay open on the desk beside the ledger, its pages filled with observations about cattle prices and weather patterns, but also with more personal reflections that revealed a man who had understood the cost of isolation. "A ranch without family," one entry read, "is just a business operation. Takes people to make it a home." Silas closed the journal and set down his pen. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own careful balance between the growing warmth of this unexpected family and the practical realities that governed their lives. But tonight, for the first time in years, his house felt truly inhabited, filled with the irreplaceable presence of people who mattered to him more than he had thought possible. The recognition should have frightened him. Instead, it felt like coming home. The first real conversation about their pasts came on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after Annie's arrival. The children had been put to bed early after a day spent exploring the creek that ran along the ranch's eastern boundary, and the house had settled into the peaceful quiet that followed a day of earned rest. Annie sat at the kitchen table mending one of Thomas's shirts, her needle catching the lamplight as she worked. Silas had intended to retreat to his office as usual, but found himself lingering in the doorway, reluctant to break the comfortable atmosphere that had developed. "You don't have to hover in the doorway like a stranger," Annie said without looking up from her sewing. "This is your house after all." "Sometimes it doesn't feel like it anymore," he admitted, taking a seat across from her. "In the best possible way." She smiled at that, a soft expression that transformed her features. "Change can be unsettling, even when it's for the better. Is that what brought you here? Change that needed to be made?" Annie's needle paused in its steady rhythm. She had been waiting for this conversation, knowing that eventually Silas would want to understand the circumstances that had driven her so far from everything familiar. The question was how much of the truth she was prepared to share. "My husband died in February," she began carefully. "James was a good man, but he was also a dreamer, always certain that the next opportunity would be the one to make our fortune." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, setting it on the table between them. It was a photograph, creased and faded, showing a serious-faced man in his 30s standing beside a younger Annie who held a baby Mary while Thomas leaned against his father's leg. "He invested everything we had in a mining venture that promised rich returns. When he died, I discovered that not only had the mine failed, but James had borrowed against our farm to fund his share of the investment. The bank gave me 60 days to settle the debt or forfeit the property." Silas studied the photograph, noting the hope in the younger Annie's face, the way James's hand rested protectively on Thomas's shoulder. "I'm sorry. That must have been overwhelming." "Overwhelming doesn't begin to describe it." Annie resumed her sewing, but her stitches had grown less precise. "I tried everything I could think of. Sold what we had of value, took in washing, even considered marrying Harold Fitzpatrick, who owned the general store and had been pursuing me since James's funeral." "What changed your mind?" Annie's laugh held no humor. "Harold made it clear that while he was willing to marry me, he had no interest in raising another man's children. He suggested they might be better off in an orphanage where they could learn proper discipline and useful trades." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Silas felt anger kindle in his chest at the casual cruelty of a man who would separate a mother from her children. "I hope you told him what you thought of that suggestion." "I did, in language that probably scandalized half the town." Annie's smile returned, warmer this time. "The next day I sold everything we couldn't carry, bought 3 tickets on the westbound train, and decided to trust that God had a plan that didn't involve abandoning my children to strangers. That took considerable courage. It took considerable desperation. Courage would have been staying and finding another way. What I did was run toward the unknown because the known had become unbearable." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Finally, Silas spoke. "I came here for similar reasons, I suppose. Not debt, but disappointment, I guess you'd call it. I was engaged to be married back in Missouri. Rebecca Patterson, daughter of the town's most prominent banker. What happened? I discovered that her affection was more for my prospects than for me personally. When a better opportunity presented itself, a railroad man with more capital and better connections, she found a way to break our engagement that left her reputation intact and mine somewhat tarnished." Annie looked up from her mending, studying his profile in the lamplight. "Her loss. I thought so at the time. Now I'm grateful things worked out as they did. Rebecca would never have been happy with ranch life, and I would have spent my life trying to become someone I wasn't in order to please her. Do you miss Missouri?" "I miss the idea of it sometimes. The certainty of knowing exactly where you fit in the world, what's expected of you. But I don't miss the feeling of living someone else's idea of what my life should be." Annie nodded, understanding implicit in the gesture. "That's exactly why I couldn't marry Harold Fitzpatrick. It would have meant accepting that other people's comfort was more important than my children's well-being. And now? Do you regret leaving Kansas? She considered the question seriously, her gaze moving to the window where moonlight silvered the desert landscape. I regret the circumstances that made leaving necessary, but I don't regret the choice itself. Mary and Thomas are thriving here in ways they couldn't back home. They have space to be children, people who care about them, a chance to grow up somewhere that values what they can become rather than dwelling on what they've lost. And what about you? What do you value about this place? The question was quietly asked, but Annie heard the deeper inquiry beneath it. She set down her sewing and met his gaze directly. I value the opportunity to be useful in ways that matter, to cook for people who appreciate the effort, to keep house for someone who notices the difference, to raise my children somewhere they can learn that not all men judge a woman's worth by her circumstances or view children as inconveniences to be managed. Annie, I know this situation is complicated, she continued before he could finish whatever he had intended to say. I know that my being here creates talk and puts you in an awkward position with your neighbors. If you decide that the complications outweigh the benefits, I'll understand. I just want you to know that these past few weeks have been, the first time in a very long while that I've felt like we might have a real future. Not just survival, but something worth building toward. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Silas's chest tighten with emotions he had been carefully avoiding. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, noting how small it seemed beneath his calloused palm. I don't want you to leave, he said simply. I know that's selfish, given the position it puts you in, but this place has become something I never knew it could be since you arrived. You and the children have made it feel like a home instead of just a ranch. Silas, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know that whatever comes, you have a place here for as long as you want it. Annie turned her hand palm up beneath his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. What if what I want puts your reputation at risk? What if staying means causing more problems than leaving? Then we'll face those problems together. I've been living carefully for too long, Annie. Maybe it's time to start living fully instead. Outside, a coyote called across the desert, its voice carrying loneliness and wild freedom in equal measure. Inside, two people who had learned to guard their hearts against further disappointment began to consider the possibility that some risks were worth taking, some connections worth fighting for. The future remained uncertain, filled with social complications and external threats they could not yet fully anticipate. But for now, in the quiet intimacy of shared confessions and tentative hope, it was enough to know they would not face that future alone. The changes began subtly, in ways that might have gone unnoticed by anyone not living within the daily rhythms of the Broken Arrow Ranch. Annie started each morning earlier, not from necessity, but from a growing sense of purpose that made rest feel secondary to the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from the ordinary tasks of daily life. That began with small touches. Wildflowers from the desert arranged in mason jars on the dining table, curtains sewn from fabric she had found, stored in the attic, cushions for the hard wooden chairs that made lingering over meals a pleasure rather than an endurance. But as days passed into weeks, these small improvements accumulated into something larger, the transformation of a house into a home. The most significant change came when Annie discovered Silas's mother's china set, carefully wrapped and stored, in the back of a cabinet as if waiting for an occasion that never came. The delicate porcelain bore a pattern of blue roses that had faded to a gentle watercolor softness, each piece bearing the small chips and hairline cracks that spoke of actual use rather than display. These are beautiful, Annie said, unwrapping each piece with reverent care. Why aren't you using them? Silas paused in his examination of the ranch's monthly accounts. watching her handle the cups with the careful attention she gave to everything. Fragile. Mother always said they were for special occasions. After she died, I suppose I never found an occasion special enough. Every day we have together is special enough, Annie replied simply, and something in her tone made him set down his pen and really look at her. She was standing in the shaft of afternoon sunlight that slanted through the kitchen window, holding one of the teacups up to the light to admire the way the sun made the translucent porcelain glow. Her hair had escaped its pins during the day's work, framing her face with auburn strands that caught fire in the golden light. In that moment, she looked like something from a painting domestic goddess, transforming the mundane into the sacred, through the simple act of caring. "You're right," he said, and meant it. That evening, they ate from china that had not seen use in over a decade. The meal was the same simple fare. Annie prepared every night roast beef, potatoes, green beans from the garden she had started behind the kitchen. But somehow, the elegant plates and careful presentation elevated it into something approaching. Ceremony. Mary and Thomas approached the delicate china with appropriate reverence, but their wonder at eating from real fancy dishes filled the dining room with a kind of joy that made even the ranch hands smile. Jake Morrison, who had probably never eaten from china in his life, handled his plate with exaggerated care that was both endearing and amusing. "Mrs. Whitlow," Billy Walsh said, cutting his meat with surgical precision, "you sure do know how to make a fellow feel civilized." "Every man deserves to feel his worth reflected in his surroundings," Annie replied. "Good food deserves good presentation, and good work deserves proper appreciation." It was a philosophy that extended beyond the dinner table. Annie began leaving small tokens of consideration throughout the house, fresh coffee ready when Silas returned from his early morning ride, a plate of cookies waiting when the men finished a particularly difficult day, wildflower bouquets in the bunkhouse that made the rough quarters feel less Spartan, but her influence reached deeper than decoration and comfort. Annie possessed an organizational mind that saw inefficiencies invisible to those too close to daily routines. She suggested changes to the kitchen layout that reduced wasted motion during meal preparation. She established a system for tracking supplies that prevented the waste that came from not knowing what was already in stock. Most significantly, she began keeping detailed records of household expenses that revealed exactly where money was being spent and where savings might be achieved. "You've reduced our food costs by nearly 20%, Silas observed one evening, reviewing the neat columns of figures in Annie's careful handwriting. "Without reducing quality or quantity. It's simply a matter of planning and timing," she explained, though he suspected it was considerably more complex than she made it sound. "Buying in season, preserving when there's abundance, making full use of what we have before purchasing what we lack." "Where did you learn to manage accounts like this?" Annie's hands stilled in their task of darning socks. James was optimistic about money. Someone had to keep track of where it was actually going versus where he thought it was going. "I learned by necessity." The comment revealed another layer of the strength that had brought her through circumstances that might have crushed someone less determined. Silas was beginning to understand that Annie's domestic skills were not simply the result of natural talent, but of hard-won experience in making the most of limited resources. This growing appreciation was complicated by an awareness that his feelings for Annie were developing beyond gratitude or even friendship. He found himself watching for her smile when he entered a room, listening for her laughter during the children's evening games, noting the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating on a difficult task. It was a dangerous progression for a man who had carefully constructed his life to avoid such complications. Annie was his employee, a woman dependent on his goodwill for her children's security. Any advancement of their relationship beyond the professional would place her in an impossible position, unable to refuse without risking her livelihood, unable to accept without compromising her reputation. Yet the attraction was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. It manifested in small ways that he hoped she had not noticed. The way he lingered over morning coffee to extend their conversations. His tendency to find excuses to work near the house during the day. The careful attention he paid to her preferences. And everything from the temperature of rooms to the topics of dinner conversation. The situation was further complicated by the children's obvious growing attachment to both him and ranch life. Thomas had progressed from helping with small tasks to becoming a genuinely useful assistant, capable of feeding chickens, gathering eggs, and performing other age-appropriate chores with reliable competence. Mary had discovered a talent for gardening that had resulted in the most productive vegetable patch the ranch had ever boasted. More troubling was the way both children had begun referring to the ranch as home and speaking of future plans that assumed their continued presence. Thomas talked eagerly about learning to ride well enough to help with cattle drives. Mary had asked permission to start a flower garden that would look beautiful next spring. These innocent assumptions created a pressure that Silas felt keenly, that children deserved stability, security, a future they could count on, but providing that future would require decisions and commitments that went far beyond his original intention of simply hiring household. Help. The weight of these considerations was interrupted one afternoon by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Silas was working in the barn when he heard the approach of multiple horses, the jingle of harness that suggested a wagon rather than riders. Stepping outside, he saw a small caravan approaching, a family wagon flanked by two men on horseback, dust rising from wheels and hooves in the characteristic cloud that announced travelers from a considerable distance. As they drew closer, Silas recognized the leader as Samuel Garrett, a rancher from the valley settlement 60 miles south. The wagon carried what appeared to be Garrett's wife and children, while the second rider was unfamiliar, a younger man with the careful posture of someone unused to long hours in the saddle. Samuel, Silas called in greeting as the group came to a halt near the main house. What brings you this far north? Business and pleasure both, Garrett replied, dismounting with the stiff movements of someone who had been traveling for days. Silas Maddox, I'd like you to meet my wife's brother, Daniel Morrison. He's come west from Ohio to look into investment opportunities. The introduction was polite enough, but Silas caught something in Garrett's tone that suggested this was not entirely a social visit. Daniel Morrison's assessment of the ranch was too careful, too thorough, for casual interest. Mrs. Garrett, Annie appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sounds of arrival. What a lovely surprise. Please, come in and rest yourselves. You must be exhausted from the journey. It was the right thing to say, the proper offer of hospitality that custom demanded. But as Silas watched Daniel Morrison's interested appraisal of Annie, he felt the first stirring of something that might have been jealousy, complicated by the unwelcome recognition that other men would inevitably notice what he was trying so. Hard to resist acknowledging himself, the visit that followed would test more than his hospitality. It would force him to confront exactly what Annie meant to him and what he was prepared to do to protect the fragile happiness they had built together. The evening that followed the Garrett's arrival revealed layers of complexity that Silas had not anticipated. What should have been a simple matter of offering hospitality to traveling neighbors became an exercise in careful navigation through social expectations and unspoken tensions. Annie had outdone herself with dinner, transforming their usual fare into something approaching feast proportions. The good china graced the table alongside, serving dishes that had not seen use since his mother's time. And the meal itself, roast chicken with sage stuffing, fresh vegetables from her garden, and a dried apple pie that filled the house with. The scent of cinnamon created an atmosphere of abundance and welcome. But Daniel Morrison's presence changed the dynamics in ways that made Silas increasingly uncomfortable. The young man from Ohio possessed the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to making favorable impressions, and he had clearly decided that Annie represented the most interesting aspect of his Western tour. Mrs. Whitlow, Daniel said, accepting. a second helping of pie with an appreciative smile. I must say this is the finest meal I've enjoyed since leaving civilization. You have remarkable talents. Thank you, Annie replied politely, though Silas caught the slight stiffness in her tone that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with the excessive praise. Daniel is looking into investment opportunities in cattle ranching, Samuel Garrett explained, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents at his table. Thinks there might be money to be made in supplying Eastern markets with Western beef. There's certainly potential, Silas agreed carefully, though it's not a business for someone looking for quick returns or unwilling to learn the realities of desert ranching. Oh, I'm quite prepared to learn, Daniel assured him, but his attention remained focused on Annie rather than the conversation. About cattle. I believe the key to success in any venture is surrounding yourself with capable people who understand the local conditions. The comment was innocent enough on its surface, but something in Daniel's tone suggested he was thinking of more than business partnerships. When Annie rose to refill the coffee pot, Daniel's gaze followed her movements with an appreciation that made Silas's jaw tighten. After dinner, as the adults settled into the front room while the children played quietly in the corner, the conversation turned to broader questions about territorial development and the challenges facing ranchers in the changing economy. Daniel proved himself knowledgeable about market conditions and financial trends, but his questions about the Broken Arrow's operations were more detailed than casual interest would warrant. You've built an impressive operation here, Daniel observed, accepting a cup of coffee from Annie with a smile that lingered longer than necessary. I imagine it takes considerable management skill to coordinate all the various aspects. Silas has 20 years of experience, Annie replied, settling into her own chair with the careful distance she maintained during formal occasions. The ranch's success reflects his dedication and expertise, and your own contributions, I'm sure. A well-managed household is essential to any successful enterprise. I've observed that the most prosperous ranches invariably have exceptional domestic management. The compliment was delivered with practiced charm, but Silas detected calculation beneath the surface. Daniel Morrison was not simply making conversation, he was gathering information and, more troublingly, making it clear that he viewed Annie as an asset worth acquiring. Mrs. Whitlow manages her responsibilities admirably, Silas said, his tone carrying a warning that Daniel either missed or chose to ignore. I'm certain she does. In fact, I find myself wondering whether such talents might not be better utilized in a larger operation, with greater resources and more opportunities for advancement. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, acrid and unwelcome. Annie's cup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down, and Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Mr. Morrison, Annie said carefully, I am quite content with my current position. Of course. Though circumstances do change, don't they? A woman of your obvious capabilities might find herself presented with opportunities that offer greater security, particularly for her children's future. It was smoothly done. The suggestion that her current situation was somehow precarious wrapped in concern for her children's welfare. But the implication was clear. Daniel Morrison was prepared to offer her something better than what she had found at the Broken Arrow. The remainder of the evening passed with increasing tension, disguised as polite conversation. Daniel continued his subtle campaign, praising Annie's cooking, her efficiency, her obvious intelligence, while simultaneously dropping hints about his own resources and prospects. Samuel Garrett, either genuinely oblivious or deliberately ignoring the undercurrents, discussed cattle prices and territorial politics with the oblivious enthusiasm of someone enjoying a social evening dot when the Garretts finally retired to the guest room that Annie had hastily prepared, and Daniel settled in the bunkhouse with expressions of gratitude for the hospitality. Silas found himself alone with Annie in the kitchen as she finished the evening's cleaning. He's persistent, Annie said quietly, not looking up from the dishes she was washing. He's calculating, Silas replied, the words carrying more edge than he intended. Daniel Morrison didn't come here looking for investment opportunities. He came looking for something else entirely. You think he was gathering information about the ranch? I think he was gathering information about you. Silas moved to help dry the dishes, needing something to occupy his hands. The questions about household management, the comments about your capabilities, that wasn't casual conversation. Annie paused in her washing, finally meeting his gaze. And if it wasn't? If he was interested in offering me employment elsewhere? The question hit him like a physical blow, though he should have seen it coming. Of course, other men would notice Annie's qualities. Of course, someone with resources might try to lure her away with promises of better wages, greater security, more opportunities for her children. Would you consider it? He asked, though he was not certain he wanted to hear the answer. That would depend on what was being offered, she said carefully, and whether I believed the person making the offer had my children's best interests at heart or merely his own convenience. And Daniel Morrison? Annie smiled then, the first genuine smile he had seen from her all evening. Daniel Morrison sees me as an acquisition that would enhance his business prospects. He's not interested in me as a person, but as a capable employee who might also provide other benefits. The relief that flooded through him was embarrassing in its intensity. You saw through his charm, then. I've had experience with men who mistake politeness for encouragement and competence for availability. Daniel Morrison is not the first to assume that a widow with children must be desperate enough to accept any offer that promises security. And are you? Desperate enough to accept any offer? The question escaped before he could stop it, revealing more of his own fears than he had intended. Annie set down the dish she had been washing and turned to face him fully. No, she said simply. I am not desperate enough to trade one form of uncertainty for another. I know what I have here, Silas. I know the people I work with, the children I'm raising, the life we're building. That has value that can't be measured in wages or promises of advancement. But if someone offered you real security, legal protection, social respectability, a future you could count on? Annie studied his face in the lamplight, reading something in his expression that made her step closer. Are you asking what I would do if someone offered me marriage? The word hung between them, honest and complicated and impossible to ignore. Marriage. The solution to the social complications that threatened their situation. The legal protection that would secure her position and her children's future. The public acknowledgement of what was growing between them, despite all the practical reasons to resist it. I suppose I am, he admitted. Then I suppose I should tell you that I would consider very carefully whether the person offering marriage was someone I could love, someone who would cherish my children as his own, someone who wanted me as a partner rather than an employee, with additional benefits. She moved even closer, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of the soap she used, see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. And I should tell you that such a person would not have to be wealthy, or charming, or concerned with impressing others with his prospects. He would simply have to be honest and kind and willing to build something real together. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibilities and promises, and the recognition that they had moved far beyond the practical arrangement that had brought her to his ranch. Silas raised his hand to touch her cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin, the way she leaned into his touch with trust that humbled him. Annie, I know this is complicated, she whispered. I know there are obstacles we haven't even discussed yet, but I also know that what we have here is worth fighting for, worth protecting against people like Daniel Morrison, who see only opportunity where we see home. He leaned down and kissed her then, gently, reverently, as if she were something precious. That might break if handled carelessly. She kissed him back with a sweetness that spoke of hope and possibility and the courage to believe in second chances. When they finally separated, both were breathing unsteadily, faces flushed with the awareness of how fundamentally their relationship had just shifted. "We'll have to be careful," Silas said softly. "If Daniel Morrison is gathering information, he's not the only one who might use our feelings against us." "Then we'll be careful," Annie agreed. "But we won't let fear make our decisions for us. We've both done enough of that already." Outside, the desert night settled around the ranch with its familiar sounds of wind and wildlife, the comfortable noises of a place where people had made a life together. Inside, two hearts that had learned to guard themselves against disappointment began to open to the possibility that some risks were worth taking, some connections worth the complications they might bring. Tomorrow would test that resolve in ways they could not yet imagine. The morning brought a reckoning that shattered the careful peace Annie and Silas had built together. It arrived in the form of a telegram delivered by a rider from town, dusty and urgent, bearing news that would test everything they had begun to believe about their future. Daniel Morrison was reading the telegram when Silas emerged from the barn, the young man's face pale despite the morning sun. Samuel Garrett stood beside him, his expression grim as he folded a second piece of paper with deliberate care. "Silas," Daniel called, his voice carrying a strange mix of excitement and concern. "I'm afraid we need to have a conversation about Mrs. Whitlow." The words sent ice through Silas's veins. He approached the two men slowly, noting how they had positioned themselves between him and the house where Annie was preparing breakfast with her usual quiet efficiency. "What kind of conversation?" Daniel held up the telegram, his earlier charm replaced by something harder, more calculating. "This is from my business associate in Kansas City, a Mr. Harold Fitzpatrick, who was kind enough to provide some interesting information about your cook." A name hit Silas like a physical blow. Harold Fitzpatrick, the store owner Annie had mentioned, the man who had wanted to marry her but send her children to an orphanage, the man she had fled Kansas to avoid. Mr. Fitzpatrick was quite concerned when he learned that Mrs. Whitlow had simply disappeared with her children, Daniel continued, his tone suggesting he was enjoying this revelation, particularly since there were some legal irregularities surrounding her late husband's affairs that the authorities wanted to discuss with her. "What kind of irregularities?" Samuel Garrett cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Daniel, perhaps this should be handled through proper channels." "No, I think Mr. Maddox deserves to know exactly who he's been harboring," Daniel interrupted. "Mrs. Whitlow's husband, you see, was not actually dead when she remarried. James Whitlow had staged his own death to escape his creditors, leaving his wife to deal with the consequences. When she discovered he was alive and living under another name in Colorado, she divorced him quietly. But that first marriage, the one that produced her children, that was bigamous." The words seemed to echo in the morning air, each syllable dropping like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to touch everything Annie and Silas had built together. Bigamy. The word carried legal consequences that could destroy her completely, social stigma that would follow her children for the rest of their lives. "You're lying," Silas said flatly, though he could see in Daniel's face that he was not. "I have documentation," Daniel replied, producing a second telegram. "Marriage records, court filings, witness statements. Mrs. Whitlow's first marriage was invalid, which makes her children." "Careful." Silas's voice carried a warning that made both men step back. "Be very careful what you say about those children." "I'm simply stating legal facts," Daniel said, though his tone had lost some of its confidence. "The point is that Mrs. Whitlow has been living under false pretenses. She's a woman without legal standing. Her children have no legitimate claims to inheritance or property, and she's wanted for questioning in Kansas regarding her husband's fraudulent death and her knowledge of his activities." Behind them, the screen door creaked open. Annie emerged onto the porch, drawn by voices that carried tension, even if the words were not clear. She moved slowly, as if walking through deep water, her face growing pale as she took in the scene. Before her, "What's happening?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected. Daniel turned toward her with the satisfied expression of a man holding winning cards. Mrs. Whitlow, or should I say Miss Reeves? I understand. That's your legal name, since your marriage to James Whitlow was never valid. Annie's face went white as morning snow, her hand gripping the porch railing for support. How did you? Harold Fitzpatrick has been looking for you for months. He's quite concerned about the children's welfare, given their irregular circumstances. He's prepared to take custody of them himself, ensure they receive proper care and legitimate names. The threat was delivered with poisonous sweetness, and Silas felt fury rise in his chest like floodwater. Get off my land. Now, Silas, Samuel Garrett interjected, let's handle this reasonably. If there are legal issues, there are no legal issues here, Silas said firmly. Mrs. Whitlow is my employee. Her children are under my protection, and whatever happened in Kansas is none of our concern. I'm afraid it is, actually. Daniel's smile was sharp as broken glass. You see, harboring a fugitive from justice is a serious crime, and Mrs. Whitlow is wanted for questioning in several matters related to her husband's fraudulent activities. I knew nothing about James's schemes, Annie said, finding her voice at last. When I discovered he was alive, I divorced him immediately. The authorities cleared me of any wrongdoing. Perhaps. But the authorities in Kansas would like to speak with you directly. And Harold Fitzpatrick has legal standing to claim custody of children born from an invalid marriage, especially when their mother is living in questionable circumstances. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Annie's presence on Silas's ranch, unchaperoned and unmarried, would be seen as scandalous regardless of the innocence of their arrangement. Combined with the questions about her legal status, it would provide ammunition for anyone seeking to destroy her claim to her children. What do you want? Silas asked quietly, recognizing extortion when he heard it. I want Mrs. Whitlow to accept employment with my operation in Colorado. I can provide legal protection, respectability, a future for her children that doesn't depend on the charity of others. In return, certain information about her whereabouts might be delayed in reaching the appropriate authorities. And if she refuses? Daniel's shrug was elaborate in its indifference. Then I suppose Harold Fitzpatrick will be very interested to learn where she can be found, along with certain territorial officials who take a dim view of moral irregularities among the settlers. They're trying to attract to Arizona. Annie moved down the porch steps like a woman walking to her execution. You're asking me to choose between my freedom and my children's safety. I'm offering you a solution to an impossible situation. Work for me, accept my protection, and these legal complications disappear. Refuse and face the consequences of your past decisions. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind through the mesquite and the distant lowing of cattle. Inside the house, Mary and Thomas were probably finishing their breakfast, unaware that their entire world was being threatened by forces they could not understand or fight. I need time to consider, Annie said finally. Of course, but not too much time. Harold Fitzpatrick is an impatient man, and the authorities in Kansas become more interested daily. I'll need your answer by tomorrow evening. Daniel remounted his horse with the satisfaction of a man who had played his cards perfectly. Samuel Garrett followed with obvious reluctance, casting apologetic glances toward Silas. It did nothing to soften the devastation his brother-in-law had wrought. As the dust of their departure settled, Annie and Silas stood in the yard facing the ruin of everything they had built together. The morning sun felt suddenly harsh, revealing flaws and shadows that had been hidden in gentler light. Is it true? Silas asked quietly. About the marriage, the legal complications? Annie nodded, tears streaming down her face. I thought it was behind me. When I learned James was alive, I divorced him immediately and took back my maiden name. But I was so desperate to escape Kansas, to protect my children from Harold's plans, that I didn't think about how it would look if the truth came out. And the children are innocent of everything except having parents who made terrible mistakes. Her voice broke on the words. They don't deserve to suffer for circumstances they couldn't control. Silas reached for her, pulling her against his chest as sobs shook her slender frame. We'll find a way through this. There has to be a legal solution that doesn't involve surrendering to Daniel Morrison's extortion. What if there isn't? What if the only way to protect them is to accept his offer? Then we'll face that when we come to it. But I'm not letting you go without a fight, Annie. Not when we've just found each other. She looked up at him then, her face wet with tears, but her eyes holding desperate hope. You still want me? Even knowing what you know now? I want you more than ever. Legal documents don't change who you are, who your children are, what we mean to each other. If the law can't see that, then the law is wrong. But even as he spoke the words, both of them understood the reality they faced. In 1890 Arizona Territory, a woman's reputation was her most valuable possession, and once destroyed, it could never be fully restored. The choice between scandal and submission was no choice at all. It was a trap designed by men who understood that. Sometimes the most effective chains were forged from social expectations rather than iron. The question now was whether their love was strong enough to break those chains, or whether they would prove as binding as Daniel Morrison clearly believed. The hours that followed Daniel Morrison's revelation moved with the strange, suspended quality of time before a storm breaks. Annie went through the motions of her daily tasks with mechanical precision, but Silas could see the tremor in her hands. As she served lunch, the way her eyes kept drifting toward her children as if memorizing their faces. Mary and Thomas sensed the tension without understanding its source. They spoke in whispers, stayed closer to their mother than usual, and watched the adults with the worried expressions of children who had learned that grown-up problems could upend their world without warning. After the midday meal, when the ranch hands had returned to their work and the children were napping in the heat, Silas found Annie sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a letter she had been trying to write for over an hour. The paper contained only a few lines, crossed out and rewritten multiple times. "What are you trying to say?" he asked gently, settling into the chair beside her. "I'm trying to find words to explain to my children why their mother might have to go away," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. How do you tell an 8-year-old that everything she thought she knew about her family was built on lies? You don't, because you're not going anywhere. Annie set down her pen and turned to face him fully. "Silas, be practical. Daniel Morrison has evidence that could destroy any chance I have of keeping my children. If Harold Fitzpatrick gains legal custody, Mary and Thomas will be separated, sent to different institutions, raised by strangers who see them as burdens rather than blessings. Then we'll fight him. There have to be lawyers who can challenge his claims, courts that will listen to reason. With what money? Against what influence? Harold Fitzpatrick is a respected businessman with connections throughout Kansas. Daniel Morrison clearly has resources and political influence. What do we have to fight them with?" The question hung between them, stark in its honesty. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, ranchers and settlers with limited resources against men who possessed both wealth and social standing. But as Silas considered the problem, a different kind of strategy began to take shape in his mind. "What we have," he said slowly, "is the truth. And we have something else Morrison doesn't expect." "What's that?" "We have community, people who know us, who have seen how you care for your children, who understand the difference between legal technicalities and moral reality." Annie shook her head. "Community support won't stand up in court against sworn affidavits and legal documents. Maybe not. But it might be enough to create consequences Morrison hasn't considered." Silas reached across the table and took her hands in his. I'm going to town to send some telegrams of my own. If Daniel Morrison wants to play games with information, then let's give him more information than he bargained for. What kind of telegrams? The kind that ask questions about Morrison's business practices, his financial backing, his reasons for being so interested in one particular woman's employment status. The kind that might reach people in Colorado who know more about his operations than he wants public. For the first time since morning, hope flickered in Annie's eyes. You think he's not as powerful as he pretends? I think men who resort to extortion usually have secrets of their own they'd prefer to keep hidden. And I think Harold Fitzpatrick's sudden interest in your children's welfare might not look as noble if certain facts about his character became public knowledge. While Silas rode to town, Annie found herself drawn to tasks that had nothing to do with household management and everything to do with preparing for an uncertain future. She mended clothes with extra care, as if perfect stitching could somehow protect the people who wore them. She baked bread with fierce concentration, kneading the dough as if she could work her fears into something useful. Most tellingly, she spent time organizing her few personal possessions, creating neat bundles. Of the things that mattered most, photographs, letters, Mary's doll, Thomas's wooden horse that Silas had carved for him. These preparations were not surrender, but strategy. The actions of a woman who understood that sometimes the best defense was being ready for whatever came. When the children woke from their afternoon rest, she gathered them on the front porch, where the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of evening coolness. Are we in trouble, Mama? Mary asked with the directness that children brought to difficult questions. There are some people who think we should live somewhere else, Annie said carefully. People who believe they know what's best for our family better than we do. But we like it here, Thomas protested. I like helping Mr. Silas with the horses. I like Jake's stories and Carlos teaching me Spanish words. I know you do, sweetheart. And if we have to leave, it won't be because we want to. It will be because sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect the people they love. Will we stay together? Mary's question carried the weight of a child who had already lost one parent and understood that families could be broken by forces beyond their control. I will fight with everything I have to keep us together, Annie promised. No matter what happens, remember that you are loved, that you are good children who deserve happiness, and that the mistakes adults make don't change your worth. When Silas returned from town near sunset, his expression was grim but determined. He carried with him not only the responses to his telegrams, but also an unexpected ally, Judge Marcus Thornton, the territorial magistrate who had been in town conducting quarterly court sessions. Judge Thornton was a man in his 60s with the kind of weathered dignity that came from making difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. He had agreed to ride out to the ranch after Silas explained the situation, partly from legal curiosity and partly from personal conviction that children's welfare should not be sacrificed to adult machinations. Mrs. Whitlow, the judge said, removing his hat as Annie rose to greet him. I understand you find yourself in difficult circumstances. Yes, sir. Though I hope you'll believe that I never intended to create legal complications for anyone. Intent matters less than consequences in legal proceedings, Judge Thornton replied, though not unkindly. But I'm more interested in present realities than past irregularities. May I speak with your children? What followed was a conversation that revealed Judge Thornton's wisdom and experience. He spoke with Mary and Thomas not as a stern authority figure, but as a grandfather might, asking about their lives, their happiness, their hopes for the future. He observed their interactions with their mother, their obvious comfort in their surroundings, their healthy, well-cared-for appearance. These children, he said to Silas and Annie, after Mary and Thomas had been sent to help Jake with the evening chores, show no signs of neglect or distress. They are clearly loved, well-educated, and thriving in their current environment. But legally? Annie asked. Legally, the situation is complex. Your first marriage was indeed invalid, which creates questions about custody rights. However, the fact that you acted in good faith, that you corrected the situation when you learned the truth, and that you have provided exemplary care for your children all weigh in your favor. Judge Thornton paused, studying the sunset that painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. I've also received some interesting information about Mr. Harold Fitzpatrick and his motivations for seeking custody. It seems his interest in your children coincides remarkably with their potential inheritance from your late husband's life insurance policy, an inheritance that would be controlled by their legal guardian. The revelation struck like lightning. Harold Fitzpatrick's sudden concern for the children's welfare was not altruism but greed, a desire to control the money that rightfully belonged to Mary and Thomas. As for Mr. Daniel Morrison, Judge Thornton continued, his business practices in Colorado have attracted some unwelcome attention from territorial authorities. Using extortion to acquire employees tends to create legal difficulties of its own. Silas felt satisfaction surge through him. His telegrams had found their mark, uncovering the secrets that Morrison and Fitzpatrick had hoped to keep hidden. So what happens now? Annie asked. Now, Judge Thornton said, we prepare for a confrontation. Morrison expects to find you isolated and vulnerable when he returns tomorrow. Instead, he'll find that his threats have consequences he didn't anticipate. As evening settled over the ranch, the three adults sat on the porch planning strategy, while the children played their evening games with the innocent joy of those who trusted the adults to solve whatever problems threatened their happiness. The desert stars emerged one by one, ancient lights bearing witness to human struggles that seemed both monumentally important and utterly temporary against the vastness of time and space. Are you ready for this? Silas asked Annie as Judge Thornton settled into the guest room for the night. I'm ready to fight for my children, she replied. I'm ready to stop running from problems and start facing them directly. And I'm ready to trust that sometimes good people can defeat bad ones, even when the odds seem impossible. He took her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and a tremor that revealed her fear. Tomorrow would test everything they believed about justice, community, and the power of love to overcome legal technicalities. But tonight, they were together, they were determined, and they were no longer alone. Sometimes that had to be enough to build victory upon. Daniel Morrison arrived at the Broken Arrow Ranch the next evening with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. He came alone this time, having left Samuel Garrett in town with expressions of regret about the unfortunate necessity of business matters. His horse moved at the leisurely pace of someone who expected no resistance to his demands. What he found instead was a tableau that clearly had not been part of his calculations. Judge Marcus Thornton sat in a chair on the front porch, his official documents spread across a small table beside him, like a statement of territorial authority. Silas stood at the porch railing, his grandfather's Colt revolver visible on his hip knot as a threat, but as a reminder that some conversations required the weight of consequence behind them. Annie emerged from the house carrying a small leather portfolio, her spine straight and her chin lifted with the dignity of a woman who had decided to stop apologizing for circumstances beyond her control. Mr. Morrison, Judge Thornton said pleasantly, not rising from his chair. How convenient. I was hoping to speak with you about some interesting information that has come to my attention. Daniel's confident expression faltered as he took in the unexpected scene. Judge Thornton. I wasn't aware you were involved in this matter. Oh, but I am. Very involved, in fact. You see, when someone threatens the welfare of children within my jurisdiction, I take a personal interest. Please dismount and join us. We have a great deal to discuss. Daniel remained mounted, his eyes moving between the three adults as he recalculated the situation. I'm not sure what you think you know, but my business is with Mrs. Whitlow regarding her employment prospects. Your business, Judge Thornton corrected gently. is extortion, which is a serious crime under territorial law. That's a strong accusation to make without evidence. Annie stepped forward, opening her portfolio to reveal several documents. You mean evidence like this telegram from Harold Fitzpatrick outlining exactly how much money he expects to control if he gains custody of my children? Or this affidavit from 3 witnesses in Kansas who can testify to his character and his real motivations? Daniel's face went pale. You can't have, or perhaps, Silas interrupted, you'd prefer to discuss this telegram from the territorial marshal in Colorado, asking about your business practices and some rather serious complaints from former employees about your methods of recruitment. The documents were Judge Thornton's doing, the result of telegrams that had reached far beyond what Daniel Morrison had anticipated. In trying to use legal technicalities to control Annie, he had exposed himself to scrutiny from authorities who took a dim view of men who exploited women and children for profit. Now then, Judge Thornton continued conversationally, shall we discuss the legal realities of your situation? You've attempted to use threats against Mrs. Whitlow to coerce her into accepting employment under false pretenses. You've threatened to separate a mother from her children using information obtained through questionable means. And you've done all of this while apparently being investigated for similar activities in Colorado. Daniel dismounted slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by the careful movements of a man who suddenly understood he was not the hunter, but the hunted. You don't understand the complexities. I understand them perfectly. I also understand that Mrs. Whitlow's legal status is far more secure than you led her to believe. Judge Thornton picked up another document from his table. This is a certification from the Territorial Records Office, confirming that her divorce from James Whitlow was legal and binding, that her children are legitimate under territorial law, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, and that Harold Fitzpatrick has no legal standing to claim custody. The words hit like physical blows, each one dismantling the careful structure of threats that Daniel had built. Annie felt her knees go weak with relief, but she remained standing, watching the man who had tried to destroy her family face the consequences of his own actions. Furthermore, the judge continued, I have here a warrant for your arrest on charges of attempted extortion, issued by the territorial marshal. You are, of course, free to contest these charges in court, but I suspect your legal difficulties in Colorado may complicate your defense. Daniel's composure cracked completely. This is ridiculous. I was simply offering employment. You were threatening to expose private information unless a woman accepted conditions she found objectionable, Silas said, his voice carrying the cold edge of a man who had reached the limits of his patience. You threatened to separate children from their mother using fabricated legal claims. And you did it all because you thought we were powerless to stop you. The mistake, Annie added quietly, was thinking that people without wealth or influence have no recourse against those who do. You forgot that truth has power of its own, and that communities protect their own when they understand what's really at stake. Around them, the ranch hands had gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the tension in the air. Jake Morrison stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face set in lines of disapproval. Pete and Carlos flanked him, their usual easy smiles, replaced by the cold stares of men who did not appreciate threats against women and children. Even young Billy Walsh had abandoned his customary cheerfulness for an expression of mature anger. These men had come to care for Annie and her children, had seen firsthand the difference between exploitation and genuine partnership. Their presence was a silent statement that Daniel Morrison faced not just legal consequences, but social ones as well. You have a choice, Mr. Morrison, Judge Thornton said, rising from his chair with the authority of territorial law behind him. You can come with me voluntarily to face these charges in court, or I can have the marshal's deputies escort you. But either way, your business with Mrs. Whitlow is concluded. Daniel looked around the assembled group, seeing his isolation clearly. For the first time. No allies, no leverage, no cards left to play. His scheme had depended on Annie's vulnerability and Silas's inexperience with legal matters. Instead, he had found himself facing people who understood that some fights were worth having, some principles worth defending. "This isn't over," he said finally, the words carrying more desperation than threat. "Yes," Annie replied with quiet certainty, "it is. Whatever power you thought you had over me, whatever fear you counted on to make me submit, it's gone. I know who I am, I know what my children mean to me, and I know that the people here see me as more than just the sum of my mistakes." Daniel mounted his horse with the defeated movements of a man who had gambled everything and lost. As he rode away under Judge Thornton's watchful eye, the assembled group felt the tension drain from the evening air like water from a broken dam. The battle was won, but the war for Annie's future, for their future together, still lay ahead. The confrontation with Daniel Morrison had been decisive, but the deeper reckoning came in the quiet hours that followed. As Judge Thornton settled into his evening correspondence and the ranch hands returned to their quarters with satisfied expressions, Silas and Annie found themselves alone on the porch with the weight of everything that had been revealed and everything that still needed to be said. "It's over," Annie said softly, but her voice carried a question beneath the statement. "The immediate threat is over," Silas agreed. "But there are still consequences to consider, decisions to make about what comes next." Inside the house, Mary and Thomas were playing a quiet game of checkers, their voices a gentle counterpoint to the adult conversation taking place beyond the screen door. They had sensed the tension of the day, but trusted in the way children did that the grown-ups would handle whatever problems threatened their security. "Judge Thornton says my legal status is secure," Annie continued, "but that doesn't change the social complications. People will still talk about a widow woman living unchaperoned on a bachelor's ranch. They'll still question the propriety of our arrangement." "Let them talk," Silas said firmly. "What matters is what we know to be true, what the people who matter to us understand about our situation." "And what is true, Silas? What are we to each other, really?" The question hung between them with the weight of everything they had been avoiding, everything they had been building toward without quite acknowledging. The crisis with Daniel Morrison had forced them to examine not just their legal vulnerabilities, but their emotional ones as well. Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. When he spoke, his words carried the careful honesty of a man who had learned the cost of leaving important things unsaid. "What's true is that I love you. I love your children. I love the life we've built together here, the way you've made this house feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep between work days. What's true is that I can't imagine going back to the way things were before you arrived." Annie felt tears gather in her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "What's true is that I love you too. I love your kindness, your patience with my children, the way you've given us not just shelter, but belonging. What's true is that I want to build a future with you, not just survive day by day." "Then marry me," Silas said simply. Not because it's the practical solution to social expectations, but because it's what we both want, because we're better together than apart, because your children deserve a father who cherishes them, because I want to spend whatever years I have left making you happy. The proposal was not delivered with elaborate romance or careful preparation, but with the straightforward honesty that had characterized their entire relationship. It was an offer made between equals, two people who had learned to value substance over surface, commitment over convenience. "Yes," Annie said, the word carrying all the hope and determination that had brought her across half a continent to find a new life. "Yes, I'll marry you. But I want to be clear about what I'm bringing to this marriage. 2 children who will need patience and guidance, a past that some people will never let me forget, and a determination to be a true partner rather than just a grateful dependent. I wouldn't want it any other way, Silas replied, reaching for her hands. I'm not looking for someone to take care of. I'm looking for someone to build something with. Someone who makes me better than I am alone. The engagement was sealed not with a ring that would come later, from the jeweler in town, but with a kiss that tasted of possibility and promises kept. Around them, the desert evening settled into its familiar rhythms. But everything felt different now, charged with the recognition that they were no longer two separate people sharing space, but a family in the truest sense. Inside the house, the children's game had grown quieter, and through the screen door, they could see Mary and Thomas watching the adults with the perceptive awareness that children brought to moments of change. Come here, you two, Silas called gently. We have something to tell you. Mary and Thomas approached with the careful curiosity of children who had learned that adult announcements could bring either wonderful or terrible news. Annie gathered them close, one on each side, while Silas knelt down to bring himself to their eye level. Mr. Silas has asked me to marry him, Annie said carefully, and I've said yes. That means if you're agreeable, he would become your stepfather, and we would all be a real family together. Thomas's face lit up with uncomplicated joy. Does that mean I can call you Papa? The question hit Silas with unexpected emotion. The casual way the boy offered trust and affection that he had never thought to ask for. If you want to, son, I'd be honored. Mary's response was more cautious, a wariness of someone who had already lost one father and understood that families could be fragile things. Will you always take care of us, even when we're difficult or make mistakes? Always, Silas promised, his voice thick with emotion. That's what fathers do. They love their children no matter what, and they protect them from anything that tries to hurt them. The conversation that followed was full of practical questions and innocent concerns. Where would they live? Here, in the house that was already home. When would the wedding be? Soon, but with time to plan properly. Could they invite Jake and the other ranch hands? Of course, they were family too, but beneath the practical discussions lay something deeper, the recognition that they were choosing each other, not just as individuals, but as a unit, committing to the messy, complicated, wonderful work of building a family from love rather than obligation. As the evening deepened into night, the four of them remained on the porch, reluctant to break the spell of this moment when everything had changed and somehow become exactly what it was meant to be. Tomorrow would bring the practical work of planning a wedding, dealing with any remaining legal complications, and navigating the social adjustments that came with their new status. But tonight, they were simply a family sitting together under the desert stars, bound by love and choice and the quiet determination to protect what they had built together against anything that might threaten it. 6 months later, the Broken Arrow Ranch bore little resemblance to the austere operation that had existed before Annie Whitlow walked through its gates. The changes were both subtle and profound, visible in everything from the flower gardens that now bordered the main house to the easy laughter that rang out from the dining room each evening that the wedding had taken place on a crisp October morning, with Judge Thornton officiating and half the territory in attendance. Annie had worn her mother's dress, carefully altered and refreshed with new lace, while Silas stood beside her in his finest suit, looking both nervous and supremely happy. Mary had served as maid of honor with the serious dignity of her 8 years, while Thomas had presented the rings with only minimal prompting from Jake Morrison, who had appointed himself the boy's unofficial grandfather. The ceremony itself had been simple but meaningful, conducted on the front porch of the ranch, house with the desert spreading endlessly behind them. When Judge Thornton pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled crowd had erupted in cheers that sent the cattle lowing in distant pastures and brought tears to more than a few weathered faces. But it was the quiet moments after the celebration that had meant the most. The sight of Silas lifting Thomas onto his shoulders, while Mary tucked her small hand into his free one, the way Annie had looked at her new family, with wonder and gratitude, the recognition that they had not just solved a problem, but created something beautiful from the ashes of loss and disappointment. Now, on a warm spring evening, Annie sat on the same porch where she had first met her husband, watching him teach Thomas the finer points of rope handling while Mary practiced her letters at a small table nearby. The scene was domestic and peaceful, but it represented victories that had been hard-won and carefully protected. The legal aftermath of Daniel Morrison's schemes had been swift and decisive. Morrison himself had been convicted of extortion and fraud, his business operations in Colorado shut down by territorial authorities, who had no patience for men who preyed on vulnerable women. Harold Fitzpatrick had withdrawn his custody claims when faced with evidence of his true motivations and the testimony of Kansas residents who had witnessed his character firsthand. More importantly, the children's inheritance from James Whitlow's life insurance had been secured in a trust that would provide for their education and future needs. Managed by Judge Thornton until they came of age, Annie no longer had to worry about their financial security or wonder whether her past mistakes would compromise their opportunities. "Mama," Mary called from her table, "how do you spell happiness?" "I-Ch-P-P-I-N-Z-S," Annie replied, noting how her daughter's handwriting had improved since they had begun working with the traveling teacher who visited the ranch monthly. "What are you writing about?" "Our family. Miss Henderson said we should write about something important to us." Annie smiled, watching as Mary bent over her composition with the concentrated effort of someone trying to capture something precious in words. These were the moments that made all the struggles worthwhile, the ordinary miracles of children learning and growing in safety, of love freely given and received. "Papa," Thomas called from where he was working with Silas, "watch this." He demonstrated the knot he had been practicing, his small fingers working with increasing confidence. "Perfect," Silas praised, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "You'll be ready to help with the spring roundup at this rate." The easy use of Papa still moved Annie deeply 6 months after the wedding. Thomas had taken to the role of Silas's son with wholehearted enthusiasm, while Mary's initial caution had gradually given way to genuine affection. They were not trying to replace the father they had lost, but rather embracing the father they had found. As the evening progressed, and the children were put to bed with the usual rituals of stories and prayers, Annie and Silas found themselves alone on the porch that had witnessed so many important moments in their relationship. The desert night was alive with its familiar sounds, the distant call of coyotes, the rustle of wind through sage, the gentle movement of horses in the corral. "Any regrets?" Silas asked, taking her hand in his as they sat together in comfortable silence. "Only that it took so long for me to find my way here," Annie replied. "Sometimes I think about all the years we might have had together if circumstances had been different. But they weren't different, and that's what makes what we have now so precious. We both had to become the people we needed to be before we could appreciate what we've found together." Annie nodded, understanding the truth in his words. Her first marriage, despite its complications, had taught her valuable lessons about love and partnership. James's dreams and failures had shown her the difference between fantasy and reality, between wanting someone to change and loving them as they were. Silas's years of solitude had taught him the value of companionship, the importance of building something lasting rather than simply accumulating wealth. "The children are thriving," she observed, changing the subject to something that never failed to bring them joy. "Mary's reading has improved so much, and Thomas is becoming quite the little rancher. They're good children. Better than I deserve, probably." "Nonsense. They adore you, and you've been exactly the father they needed, patient but firm, loving but not indulgent. You've given them something I couldn't provide alone, the security of knowing they belong somewhere, that they're wanted and valued for who they are." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Jake Morrison and Pete Hernandez were returning from a trip to town, their saddlebags loaded with supplies and mail. Jake's weathered face bore the satisfied expression of someone bringing good news. "Letter for you folks," he called, dismounting with the creaking joints of a man who had spent too many years in the saddle. "From back east, looks like." The letter was from Rebecca Patterson, now Rebecca Whitman, the woman who had broken Silas's heart all those years ago in Missouri. Annie read it aloud in the lamplight, noting the formal tone that barely concealed disappointment and regret. Rebecca wrote of her marriage to the railroad man, her move to Chicago, the social success she had achieved but found somehow hollow. She had heard through mutual acquaintances about Silas's marriage and prosperity, and wrote to congratulate him while hinting at her own dissatisfaction with the choices she had made. "She sounds lonely," Annie observed, folding the letter carefully. "She sounds like someone who got exactly what she thought she wanted and discovered it wasn't enough," Silas replied. "I feel sorry for her, but I'm grateful things worked out as they did. If she hadn't broken our engagement, I never would have come to Arizona. I never would have built this ranch, never would have been here when you needed a place to land. Do you think she regrets letting you go? Probably. But regret doesn't change anything, and I wouldn't trade what we have for anything she could offer." As they prepared for bed, moving through the nighttime routines that had become second nature, Annie reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a desperate widow with few options and fewer resources, clinging to her children and hoping for nothing more than survival. Now she was a beloved wife and mother, partner in a thriving ranch, secure in the knowledge that her children would grow up surrounded by love and opportunity. The bedroom they shared had been transformed from Silas's Spartan quarters into a genuine sanctuary, decorated with touches that spoke of feminine care without losing its essential masculinity. Annie's few precious possessions were arranged alongside Silas's family heirlooms, creating a space that belonged to both of them. As they settled into bed, Silas pulled her close with the easy affection of a man who no longer had to guard his heart against disappointment. "I love you, Mrs. Maddox," he murmured against her hair. "I love you too, Mr. Maddox," she replied, marveling at how naturally the name came to her now, how completely she had embraced this new identity as wife, mother, and partner. Outside their window, the desert night continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human joys and sorrows, but somehow blessed by them nonetheless. In the morning, there would be work to do, challenges to face, the endless tasks that made up a life well lived. But tonight, in the sanctuary they had created together, there was only love and contentment, and the quiet satisfaction of people who had found their way home. The newspaper advertisement that had brought them together was long since forgotten, replaced by the reality of a partnership that had exceeded both their hopes and expectations. What had begun as a desperate arrangement between strangers had become the foundation of a love story that would endure for all the years to come, a testament to the power of second chances and the courage to believe in the possibility of happiness. After lost in the gentle darkness of the Arizona night, the Broken Arrow Ranch settled into peaceful sleep, its inhabitants secure in the knowledge that some gambles were worth taking, some risks worth embracing, and some families worth fighting. For against any odds that might threaten them,